Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to tackle something really central, but often pretty confusing in Aleister Crowley's work, the Holy Guardian Angel. We've got Erwin Hessle's big review, the Holy Guardian Angel, as our main guide here.
Yeah, it's a great resource.
And our mission, basically, is to figure out what Crowley actually meant by HGA, cutting through all the different takes out there.
It's definitely a vital thing to explore. Hessle makes it clear right away, the HGA, and getting the knowledge and conversation of it, the KCHGA, it's like super crucial, but also really misunderstood in Crowley's stuff.
Totally. And for you listening, why bother with this? Well, if you've ever felt kind of lost in Crowley's world, which can be pretty dense, let's be honest.
Dense is one word for it.
This deep dive is your shortcut. We're zeroing in on what he really thought about this key idea so you don't have to wade through all the ambiguous bits and conflicting opinions yourself.
Exactly. Think of it as getting right to the heart of a cornerstone of his philosophy. Hessle really hammers home just how fundamental the HGA was for Crowley. Oh yeah. It wasn't just, like, important. He flat out equated achieving the KCHGA with the great work.
The great work. The main goal of his whole system.
The main goal. The ultimate aim.
Wow. Okay. Hessle points to some really strong quotes from Crowley on this, doesn't he?
He does. Like in One Star in Sight, Crowley basically says getting the KCHGA is the essential work of every man. Nothing else compares. Not for your own progress, not for helping others.
Right. He says without it, you're kind of stuck, like the unhappiest and blindest of animals. But with it, you become a co-heir of the gods, a lord of light. That's pretty high stakes.
Huge stakes. Yeah. And it wasn't just a phase. Hessle shows, this pops up again later, like in Magic Without Tears, near the end of his life.
Yeah.
Still calling KCHGA the central and essential work of the magician.
So consistent right through.
Very consistent on its importance.
And Hessle notes it wasn't just some, abstract goal either. Crowley tied KCHGA and the great work together in Liber Aleph, even way back in magic and theory and practice. It's step one for an adept.
Indispensable first step.
Okay, so it seems the Holy Guardian Angel wasn't just some, angel floating around outside of you in Crowley's system.
That's a really key point Hessle explores. Crowley also used Holy Guardian Angel to talk about the true will. Or, maybe more accurately, the revelation of your true will.
Ah, okay.
He cites Crowley's Heart of the Master, where it says consciously getting your true will is akin to that called the attainment of the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel.
Akin to it. So closely linked.
Very closely linked. And it gets even clearer later in his comments on the Book of the Law. Hessle points to the new comment on AL SAR 7. Crowley talks about our silent self emerging as the word of our true wills.
The silent self.
Yeah. And he says the adept's job is KCHGA, to realize your basic nature and purpose and then,
fulfill it. And there's that other comment too, right? On AL2 65.
Exactly. That's where he spells it out. The Holy Guardian Angel is the true self, and the true will is how that self acts.
Wow. Okay. He explicitly defines it as the true self.
Explicitly. He even links the HGA to Hadith, saying each person is the husk of Hadith. It strongly suggests something internal, deep inside each of us.
So HGA is the goal, KCHGA is the great work, but it's also somehow us, our true self, tied to our true will, like a potential we need to unlock.
Exactly. It's this inherent thing waiting.
But then Hessle brings up something kind of surprising. Crowley himself apparently called the term Holy Guardian Angel.
Wow.
Absurd.
Yeah, he did. It's pretty wild. In Magic, in Theory and Practice, Chapter 2, Hessle goes into detail here. Crowley explained why he picked this weird-sounding term.
Okay.
He said he wanted a simple way to talk about his main goal for humanity, the next step. He could have used terms like God or the higher self or agites.
Agites. That's like the purified soul thing from Hermetics.
Yeah, that kind of enlightened aspect, all terms with tons of philosophical baggage, right?
Definitely.
But Crowley felt, having passed through the realm of reason, that basically any statement is a bit absurd anyway. So he chose the obtaining of the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel. Because the idea behind it, a literal guardian angel watching over you, was so patently absurd that only simpletons would waste much time in analyzing it.
That's quite the reason. Avoid analysis by being absurd.
Pretty much. Hessle quotes J.F.C. Fuller, who got it from a Crowley letter in the Equinox. Crowley's logic was, 1, Abramellin's magic system, which uses angels, was simple and it worked.
Okay, practical.
2, using an obviously absurd term would mortify the metaphysical man, basically stop people getting too hung up on philosophical theories about it.
Discourage overthinking.
Right. And 3, Even a child could grasp the basic idea. It was meant as a practical label, not some deep philosophical truth in itself.
A convention, not a dogma.
Exactly. But the irony, as Hessle points out,
is that tons of people did build philosophical systems on a literal angel idea.
Precisely. Which leads us right into that common argument you hear in occult circles.
Yeah.
The subjective-objective debate.
Right. Is the HGA inside us part of our mind? Or is it an actual separate being out there?
And Hessle argues pretty strongly that this whole either-or thing is kind of a false dichotomy. He thinks Crowley's view is actually fairly consistent, even if the way he talked about it wasn't always crystal clear.
Okay, so let's unpack that. First, this idea of an objective HGA. Where does that mainly come from?
Hessle points mostly to magic. Without Tears, Crowley's later stuff, often seen as his, more mature thinking. There's that key quote.
The one about?
The holy guardian angel is something more than a man, possibly a being who has already passed through the stage of humanity.
Ah, right.
And then he really hits it. He is not, let me say with emphasis, a mere abstraction from yourself. And that is why I have insisted rather heavily that the term higher self implies a damnable heresy and a dangerous delusion.
Wow. Damnable heresy. Strong words.
Very strong. Hessle really highlights this. Crowley stresses the HGA is something more than a man, maybe a being we can relate to, like a friend or brother or even father.
But not just a part of us, not an abstraction.
Absolutely not. He really dismisses higher self forcefully.
Okay, so why? Why was he so against higher self? What was the problem with that idea specifically?
Hessle digs into this. He looks at the letter right before that one in Magic Without Tears, the one called This Self-Introversion, and also back at that new comment on ALI 65.
And the takeaway is?
The crucial thing is, rejecting higher self didn't mean Crowley was rejecting the idea that the angel experience is internal or subjective. That's not the point he was making.
Okay. That's a key distinction.
It really is. Crowley argued the angel is a distinct individual with its own universe, like a person or even, a bug. He saw higher self as just, an idealized concept, like taking your favorite qualities and calling them divine.
Like a glorified version of yourself.
Exactly. And Hessle stresses this rejection of higher self doesn't mean rejecting internal concepts altogether, because Crowley himself linked the HGA to the Agates, that purified soul thing again, and even Socrates' genius, which everyone sees as an inner guide.
So the problem wasn't internal. It was the specific concept of higher self being too self-congratulatory, maybe?
Sort of, yeah. And Hessle explains why this higher self approach can be tricky, especially when you try to figure out if a message really came from the angel.
How so?
Well, he gives examples, like from Will Parfit or discussions on laashatila.com, where people suggest judging angelic messages by whether they feel right or ring true for you.
Okay. Seems reasonable on the surface.
But Hessle says this is exactly what Crowley warned against in the self-introversion letter. It's self-deception territory.
Right, because if you only accept things that already fit what you think and feel, you're not learning anything new, are you?
Exactly. You're just confirming your biases. You're certainly not discovering your true will, which might be completely different from what you think you want or believe.
True growth means going beyond your comfort zone.
Absolutely. Hessle contrasts this higher self view, where the problem is often seen as just failing to do what you already know is right, with the thelemic view, which, as Crowley says in the intro to Magic in Theory and Practice, is that the real problem is we often don't even know what's truly proper for us. We don't know our true will.
It's about discovery, not just execution.
Precisely. Uncovering something hidden, which links directly to Hessle's next point about needing an independent intelligence.
Okay.
Yeah. Hessle argues a big reason Crowley ditched higher self was because genuine KCHGA needs to involve getting knowledge, which is incontestably not one's own.
Information you couldn't have come up with yourself.
Right. He points to that appendix on the astral plane in Magic, in Theory and Practice.
Yeah.
Crowley warns about your own imagination just cooking up phantoms. A real encounter should feel like meeting a stranger, something that actually changes you.
It can't just be an echo chamber in your own head.
Exactly.
But then what about the reality of these independent intelligences? Did Crowley think they were, like, literally real beings out there?
The reality question. This is where Hessle brings in Crowley's mongoose and snakes parable from Magic in Theory and Practice. It's quite clever.
How does that work?
Well, Crowley basically uses it to show that whether the mongoose or the astral being is real, in some ultimate ontological sense, isn't really the point. What matters is the effect. Does it work? Is the interaction useful?
So it's more about pragmatism than metaphysics.
Very much so. Hessle also quotes Crowley's notes on the nature of the astral plane. Crowley says it's just more convenient to assume the objective existence of an angel, but the actual reality isn't the main issue.
Convenient assumption, not proven fact.
Right. And he even warns against claiming astral beings are real unless you have proof that any qualified person can check and verify.
Okay.
So this brings us back to objective individual. It doesn't necessarily mean a separate being floating around in space.
So what did Crowley mean by objective then in that Magic Without Tears letter? Hessle has a take on this.
Yeah, he suggests thinking about someone like Zeus. Zeus is a disembodied being in mythology, right? And he has characteristics, stories, things you can objectively find out about him in the myths. These details exist independently of what you personally dream or think about Zeus. He's not just a vague, subjective feeling.
Okay, so objective means having defined characteristics, a recognizable identity, separate from just my personal imagination.
Exactly. Doesn't have to mean physically real, like a table or chair. It means it has properties independent of any one person's mind.
I see. And that helps make sense of his distinction between different kinds of angels, the non-microcosmic and microcosmic ones.
Precisely. For non-microcosmic angels, spirits of elements, planets, that sort of thing, their objectivity comes from being personifications of definite things with reliable qualities. Like the spirit of Mars will always have martial qualities.
Predictable based on what they represent.
Right. For microcosmic angels like Astarte or Zeus, mythological figures, their objectivity comes from having established stories and attributes defined by legend. They're definite individuals within that framework, even if they're imaginary from a literal standpoint.
So defined by culture and myth rather than nature.
Yeah. And Hessle really stresses calling them objective individuals doesn't mean Crowley thought they were walking around like real people. He uses the example of Nekiel, the intelligence of the sun, from magic in theory and practice to make that clear.
That clarifies objective a lot. It's about definition and independence from my whims, not necessarily literal existence.
Exactly.
But then Hessle dives into what he calls the AWAS problem. This sounds tricky.
Oh, it is. This is probably the biggest apparent contradiction in all of Crowley's stuff about the HGA.
Because Crowley claimed AWAS, the entity who supposedly dictated the Book of the Law, was his own HGA.
That's the claim. And Hessle systematically lays out all the problems this creates.
Such as?
Well, first, there's Crowley in One Star in Sight saying your HGA is super personal, a secret, right? But then he publishes Liber Samek, the ritual he used to invoke AWAS. Not very secret.
Good point. What else?
The timing. The Book of the Law was received in 1904. But Crowley describes achieving KCHGA, supposedly with AWAS, in 1906, in the Equinox of the Gods. The dates don't quite line up smoothly.
Okay.
And maybe the biggest one. Crowley spent years doubting, fighting against, even rejecting the message of the Book of the Law.
Which is weird if it came from his HGA, the source of his true will.
Extremely weird. Hessle quotes Crowley admitting he fought against AWAS and the book. Even late in life, in Magic Without Tears, he says something like, "You disagree with AWAS, so do all of us." That's not exactly harmonious conversation with your deepest self.
No kidding. Seems like the opposite.
And there's more. Crowley insisted none knoweth the name of his brother's God or the rite that invokes him. Your HGA is unique to you.
Right.
And he constantly told other people they needed to invoke his supposed HGA AWAS. How can someone else invoke your true self? It doesn't fit the model.
Yeah, that seems like a major inconsistency.
It really is.
Yeah.
And Hessle notes that even within the Equinox of the Gods, where he discusses AWAS, there are contradictions. He defines the HGA as our secret self, our subconscious ego.
Which sounds internal.
But then his discussion of AWAS seems to clash with that very definition.
Yeah.
He even weirdly suggests the HGA could be another human being at one point.
It sounds like a real tangle.
It is. Hessle's conclusion basically is that Crowley probably used the term holy guardian angel differently when talking about AWAS.
Yeah.
Maybe to give the Book of the Law more weight, more authority.
So the AWAS situation is maybe an outlier, a special case we shouldn't use to define the HGA concept generally.
That seems to be Hessle's take. It's a problem, but maybe a separate one from the main thread of HGA thought.
Okay, so putting the AWAS puzzle aside for now, Hessle then brings us back to the idea of the HGA as some kind of individual, internal or external that you go to for advice. He mentions that orphan and guardian analogy from Crowley.
Right, in Magic Without Tears. It paints a simple picture. Seeking guidance from someone wiser. But then Hessle also brings up that quote where Crowley talks about intelligent beings far superior to humans.
Ah, the one that often gets linked to, like, aliens or secret chiefs.
Exactly. That's the one.
Yeah.
But Hessle points out, importantly, that Crowley doesn't actually connect that specific idea directly to the personal KCHGA journey or the objective individual HGA we discussed earlier. It's sort of a separate comment.
Okay. But then Hessle raises a really fundamental question about getting advice from any source, internal or external, doesn't he?
He does. It's the validation problem. How do you know the advice is actually good for you?
Right. Even if it's a higher being, how do you know its interests align with yours? He uses that unsettling analogy.
Of humans and cows, yeah.
Yeah.
Just because something is higher doesn't mean it has your best interests at heart.
And the same problem applies if you think of the HGA as just an internal projection of personality. Right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Hessle reminds us, our personalities are full of contradictions, bad habits, self-sabotage. Which voice are you listening to? Is it really wisdom or just your ego talking?
So it leads to this paradox. If you have to judge the messages to see if they're valid,
then you must already know what's valid on some level. So why do you need the angel in the first place? You're just filtering it through your existing judgment.
you're back to square one, potentially just reinforcing your own biases.
Exactly. Which leads Hessle to suggest a completely different way of looking at it.
Which is?
The HGA as the true self.
Yeah.
Not an advisor to the self, but the self itself.
Okay, how does that work? It means redefining self.
Precisely. The everyday conscious mind, your ego, isn't the real you. It's more like static or a veil obscuring the real you, the true self.
So KCHGA isn't having a chat with an entity.
No, it's the realization, the experience, that you are not just that limited conscious mind. It's about dropping the ego's limited interests and connecting with that deeper reality.
And in that state, the whole problem of assessing the guidance disappears.
Because there's no conflict. You're not getting advice from somewhere else. You are the source, the true will, operating directly once the conscious mind's interference is removed.
Hessle finds support for this in Liber Samekh.
Read time. He quotes directly from it. Crowley talks about concentrating the deepest self, the part that unconsciously knows the true will, on realizing the HGA.
And getting the conscious mind out of the way is key.
Crucial. Crowley stresses the need for the absence of bodily, mental, and astral consciousness. All that noise, the ego's chatter, makes us deaf to the soul, to the true self.
So the conversation happens when the conscious mind finally shuts up enough.
And achieves freedom from prejudice and the limitations of rationality, yeah. Then it can perceive the true self and true will that were there all along.
And this fits with Crowley linking the HGA to things like the Agiades and Socrates' genius.
Exactly. Hessle connects those dots. He touches on the Agies relating to purifying the soul, getting rid of limitations, referencing Thomas Taylor, the Neoplatonist translator. And he mentions Kaufman's view of Socrates' genius or daemonion as an internal oracle, a deep inner knowing. So these seemingly external things actually point inwards.
It keeps coming back to an internal reality, a deeper layer of self.
Yes. And Hessle highlights Crowley's new comment on ALI 8-9. That passage talks about the light within being veiled by the mind and body.
Really old.
Yeah. And the great work is described as making those veils transparent, dissolving psychological complexes, dissolving the stuff that blocks the light.
Which sounds a lot like stilling the mind, like in Book 4.
It does. Hessle uses that great solar analogy from Deleuze Bellum, too. The kingdom of God is within you, like the sun, but it's hidden by the earth's shadow, our own noisy, limited conscious mind.
That's a powerful image. The light is always there, just obscured.
And you see this theme hammered home in Liber Cordis Cinti Serpente, one of the Thelemic holy books.
How so?
Hessle points out how it repeatedly says the HGA is already within you. Before I saw thee, thou was already with me. Communion requires paying attention inwardly. It contrasts being distracted by many things with the focus needed to behold the angel again, that stilling of the conscious mind from Liber Samekh.
It's about shifting focus from the outer noise to the inner presence.
Exactly. And there's more support in the new comment on AL 3rd, 6062. Hessle shows Crowley linking the assimilation of thelema, dissolving complexes, unveiling yourself, all directly to attaining KCHGA.
Unveiling, making the veils transparent.
Right. Coming to the silent self, the cobs within, making the veils transparent. It's the same core idea again and again.
And Crowley talks about this misunderstanding of self elsewhere, too.
Oh, yeah. Hessle points to little essays toward truth and magic without tears. Crowley writes about how we mistake the ego for the self, how the rational mind resists this deeper understanding, how the real self is hidden behind the mind and body.
Hidden behind the instruments.
Yes. and how you have to perceive the layers around the self from the inside out.
There's also that story about Frank Bennett, right?
Ah, yeah, Hessle recounts that anecdote from Crowley's Confessions. Crowley makes some seemingly offhand remark, and Bennett goes into this 3-day trance and has a breakthrough.
And the explanation?
According to the footnotes by Simons and Grant, Crowley basically told Bennett that initiation is about getting the subconscious mind, which Crowley linked to the HGA and true self, to work without the conscious mind messing things up.
Getting the ego out of the driving seat.
Pretty much. Let the true self operate unimpeded. Hessle even quotes little essays toward truth again, where Crowley talks about learning to live without that interfering murderous consciousness that hides the true will.
So the true will should just spring up naturally from within.
Yeah, like silence being the unimpeded flow of will. Stop the interference, and it flows.
So looking at all this evidence Hessle pulls together.
The conclusion is pretty striking, isn't it? Hessle argues there's actually remarkable consistency in how Crowley presents the HGA across decades of writing.
Consistently as the true self, hidden by the conscious mind.
Yes, and this understanding is tied directly, inextricably, to discovering the true will. It's the core of Thelema, really.
So interpretations involving, like, aliens or just personality projections.
Hessle argues they miss the point and actually undermine Crowley's whole system and what Thelema is about.
Okay, so let's try and recap the main points from this deep dive. The KCHGA, knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel.
It's not really a chat with an angel, buddy, or your idealized ego.
No, it's the great work. It's fundamentally about realizing and connecting with your deepest, truest self.
A self that's usually hidden or drowned out by our everyday conscious mind.
Right. The objective talk doesn't have to mean a separate being, and the whole AOS thing seems like a confusing exception, not the rule.
And the main task is making those inner veils, the ego, the complexes, the noise transparent, so that true self can shine through.
That seems to be the core message running through Crowley's work on the HGA, according to Hessle's analysis.
Which leads to a final thought for you, the listener, something provocative to chew on.
Consider your own sense of who you are. If this holy guardian angel or true self is something that's veiled, hidden by your normal thoughts, your feelings, your perceptions, what could you actually do to maybe perceive it more clearly?
That's a big question.
Is all the noise in your head, the constant chatter of your conscious mind, actually stopping you from hearing something deeper, a different kind of inner voice maybe? Or stopping you from understanding what you really fundamentally desire or need, your true will?
It's definitely food for thought.
Yep.
How much of our perceived reality is just the veil?
Exactly. And if you want to explore this more, we really recommend going to the sources. Check out the texts we mentioned. Liber Semec, Liber Cordis Cinque Serpente, Magic Without Tears are crucial.
Maybe even look into Abramelin or think about Socrates' genius. See how these ideas resonate for you.
Ultimately, as Kali presented it, figuring out the Holy Guardian Angel seems less about theology and more about a profound personal journey of self-discovery. Practices like meditation or introspection could be starting points for your own investigation.
A journey inwards, essentially.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for taking the deep dive with us today.